The smell reaches you before you even open your eyes. It is thick and warm and faintly smoky. A smell that belongs entirely to that house, to that decade, to that particular corner of the world. It is the smell of coal dust settling in the grate from the night before, of yesterday's supper still clinging to the curtains, of a damp flannel hanging over the bathroom tap, and a bar of Lifebuoy soap slowly dissolving in its dish. It is, unmistakably, the smell of a British home in the 1970s. And somehow, without anyone explaining it to you, without anyone putting it into words, you knew, the moment you drew that first breath of the morning, exactly where you were, exactly when you were. You were home. Welcome to a 1970s British home. And this morning, this ordinary, extraordinary morning, is the one we are going to spend together. Not in some grand house with a housekeeper and a drawing room, not in a museum or a reconstruction, but in a real home. A semi-detached house on a quiet road somewhere in the Midlands, the kind of road that had 40 houses on it and all 40 looked more or less the same from the outside, and yet behind every front door was a world unto itself. This is one of those worlds, and today you are going to live it from the very first light of morning to the last creak of the staircase at night. Come inside, wipe your feet. The day has already begun. It is 6:30 in the morning, and the bedroom is cold in a way that modern rooms simply are not. There is no central heating humming quietly in the background, no thermostat set to come on at a civilized hour. What there is in the corner of the room is a 2-bar electric fire with an orange glow that hasn't been switched on yet because no one wants to run up the electricity bill. The window has a thin skin of condensation on the inside of the glass, on the inside, and the lino floor beyond the edge of the rug is something you do not touch with bare feet unless you are prepared for a shock. You are wearing a vest under your pajamas. You have been wearing it since October. Getting up in a 1970s British home required a kind of courage that the modern world has entirely forgotten. The bed was warm, genuinely, deeply warm. The way a bed is warm when it has been slept in for 8 hours with a hot water bottle tucked in at the foot, and everything outside of it was not. You didn't linger. You pulled on your clothes quickly, in a specific order that minimized the amount of time any one part of you was exposed to the air, and you headed downstairs. The stairs were carpeted in a pattern that, if you described it today, people would not believe you. Burnt orange, brown, a geometric swirl that seemed to pulse slightly if you looked at it too long. It had been laid in 1971, purchased from the Carpetright on the High Street, and it had cost a great deal of money at the time. It was, in that house, a source of considerable pride. Downstairs, the kitchen was where the morning truly lived. The kitchen in a 1970s British home was not a showpiece. It was not a room you photographed or designed. It was a room you worked in, and it showed. The units were probably Formica, white or avocado green or a deep harvest gold, depending on the year they were fitted and the taste of whoever had chosen them. The worktop had a small burn mark near the kettle where someone had set something down one too many times. There was a tea towel hanging from the oven handle that had a picture of a robin on it, a Christmas gift from 3 years ago that was still in use because it was a perfectly good tea towel. The kettle was not electric in the way you now understand the word. It was a stove-top kettle, or if the family had moved with the times, one of the very early electric kettles, a Russell Hobbs perhaps, the K2 model, which had been on the market since 1960. It was chrome, heavy, and made a sound when it reached the boil that was nothing at all like the click of a modern kettle. It was a rumble that built slowly, a rattle that grew into something almost impatient, and then the whistle that cut through every other sound in the house. Tea was everything in that kitchen. The pot was warmed first. You warmed the pot, always, because that was how it was done, and the reasons for doing it had long since stopped needing to be explained. The tea was loose leaf more often than not, though by the mid-1970s the tea bag was well on its way to conquest. PG Tips had been selling tea bags since the 1950s, and by 1976 they were already one of the best-selling tea brands in the country. The chimpanzee adverts were on the telly. Everyone knew them. But in a great many homes, the caddy on the shelf still held something loose, and the strainer still hung on its little hook beside the pot. Breakfast in that house was not complicated, and it was not optional. You ate before you went out. That was simply the rule. If it was a weekday, you might have had a bowl of Weetabix, 2 biscuits, a splash of milk from the bottle that had been on the doorstep since 6 o'clock, and enough sugar spooned over the top to make it worth eating. The milk was full fat, delivered by the milkman on his electric float, which you could sometimes hear at the far end of the road before it arrived at your door. That soft, high whir of the motor and the clink of bottles, as regular and reliable as the sunrise. In 1974, there were still around 100,000 milkmen making their rounds across Britain. The doorstep delivery was not a luxury. It was simply how milk arrived. The radio was on. It was always on. BBC Radio 2, most likely, or if someone had been fiddling with it the night before, Radio 1, with its jingles and its disc jockeys who spoke as though everything they said was the most exciting thing that had ever been said. Terry Wogan might have been on, warm and unhurried, or Tony Blackburn, who was incapable of letting a single moment pass without filling it with something cheerful. The radio sat on the windowsill, a small transistor model, and it made the kitchen feel connected to the wider world in a way that felt, at the time, perfectly sufficient. By 8:30, the house was in motion. If there were children, they were in their uniforms, grey trousers or a grey skirt, a white shirt, a tie if the school required it, a blazer with a badge on the breast pocket that had been sewn on by hand, school shoes, real leather ones, or the ones that looked like leather, had been polished the night before, or were supposed to have been. The satchel was a brown leather thing, heavy even when empty, with brass buckles that were always slightly stiff. Inside it, an exercise book, a pencil case, a packed lunch wrapped in greaseproof paper and tucked into a small plastic box that smelled faintly of yesterday's sandwiches, no matter how many times it was washed. The packed lunch was, in itself, a document of the era. There was a sandwich, likely white bread because brown bread was still considered slightly eccentric in many households, with a filling of cheese and Branston pickle, or ham and a scraping of margarine, or egg mayonnaise if someone had gone to a bit of trouble. There was a Kit Kat probably, still in its silver foil wrapper inside the red paper sleeve, or perhaps a club biscuit or a penguin. There was a small bag of crisps, Golden Wonder or Tudor, not Walkers, because Walkers didn't really become dominant until the 1980s. And there was a piece of fruit, an apple or an orange, packed in with the best of intentions and returned home uneaten 9 times out of 10. The children went out the front door, and the sound of it closing was one of the sounds of that house. A particular thud, followed by the brief rattle of the letterbox settling back into place. And then the house was quieter. The morning that followed belonged to whoever stayed behind, and often in that decade, it was the woman of the house. This is not a judgment. It is simply the reality of how most British households were arranged in the 1970s. In 1971, just over half of women were in some form of paid work. By 1975, that number was rising, but the domestic rhythms still fell to one person. The continental quilt, as it was sometimes called, was beginning to appear in the shops by the mid-1970s, and some adventurous households had adopted it, but the traditional layering of sheet, blanket and eiderdown was still the standard. Making a bed like that was not a 30-second job. It was a considered activity. The Hoover was plugged in at the wall and dragged from room to room, trailing its heavy flex behind it, making the particular sound that only a 1970s vacuum cleaner made. That deep, muscular roar that meant the whole house knew cleaning was happening. The windows were cleaned with a damp cloth and then buffed with a piece of screwed-up newspaper. This was not a folk remedy. It was effective. The newspaper left no smears, and it smelled of ink and effort. And when you were finished, the glass had a clarity to it that was quietly satisfying. Shopping happened on foot or by bus, and it happened regularly. Not in one great weekly expedition to a vast out-of-town supermarket, but in smaller, more frequent trips to a collection of individual shops that each did one thing well. You went to the baker's for bread. The loaves were on a shelf behind the counter, and the woman behind the counter knew your name, or knew your mother's name, and there was always a brief exchange. about the weather, about someone's relative, about something that had happened in the town, before the bread was wrapped in a paper bag and handed over. The smell in that baker's was almost unreasonably good. It was warm and yeasty and sweet, and it hit you as soon as you pushed open the door, and it stayed with you long after you left. You went to the butcher's for meat. The butcher's had sawdust on the floor and a row of carcasses in the window that no one found troubling, because this was simply what a butcher's looked like. The meat was chosen, cut to your specification, wrapped in white paper and tied with string. The butcher wore a striped apron. He was probably called Ray or Derek. And then there was the greengrocer, the true heart of the 1970s British shopping experience. The vegetables were on display outside in wooden crates, even in winter, and they were seasonal in a way that is now almost impossible to recreate. You ate what was in season. Strawberries in June, not in January. Brussels sprouts in November, not in May. The rhythms of the year were written in the greengrocer's window, and you followed them without thinking, because that was the only option available. The supermarket existed by this point. Tesco had been expanding since the early 1960s, and Sainsbury's and Fine Fare and international stores all had their presence on the high street. But they sat alongside the independent traders rather than replacing them. The idea that one building could supply everything you needed for a week and that you would drive to it had not yet fully colonized the British imagination. Not yet. Lunch at home in the 1970s was often called dinner. If you were a child home from school, perhaps it was a Saturday, or perhaps your school still had a midday meal break long enough to walk home and back. Lunch was a hot meal, not a sandwich. Soup from a tin, quite possibly Heinz tomato, which cost around 9 pence in 1974 and was eaten by approximately the entire nation. Or a piece of cheese on toast made under the grill that lived inside the oven and required you to open the door and crouch slightly to see what was happening, so that you would burn the toast approximately half the time and undercook it the other half. Or it might have been bubble and squeak if there were leftovers from the night before. The 1970s British kitchen was not wasteful. Leftover potato, leftover cabbage, pressed flat in the frying pan with a knob of butter, the butter hissing and spitting when it hit the pan. Cooked until both sides were golden and slightly crispy. There was no recipe. There was no measurement. There was only the pan, the heat, and the knowledge that had been passed wordlessly from one generation to the next. The afternoon unfolded slowly. In winter, by 3 o'clock, the light was already going, a characteristic of the British winter that was simply accepted, like the damp or the queues. The curtains were drawn early, not out of any desire to shut the world out, but because the single-pane windows let the cold pour through in a way that felt almost personal. The coal fire was lit, in those homes that still had one, or the gas fire was turned on, the one with the ceramic elements that glowed orange and created a warmth that radiated outwards in a particular, uneven way. Warm if you were close and cool if you weren't. You arranged yourself accordingly. The cat, if there was one, had already taken the best spot. The after-school snack was a glass of squash, Ribena perhaps, or Robinson's barley water, diluted to a colour that bore little resemblance to any fruit found in nature, and a digestive biscuit or a rich tea, taken from the tin that lived in the kitchen cupboard and was replenished each week without ceremony or comment. The television in a 1970s British home was a piece of furniture. It was not mounted on a wall. It sat on the floor, on its own stand, or sometimes on top of a unit, and it had a screen that was curved slightly at the edges, and it was very probably a rented set. Radio rentals and DER were the dominant names. There were 3 channels, not 30, not 300. 3. BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, and the schedules were fixed, and you worked around them. Blue Peter was on BBC One at 5:05 on a Monday, Wednesday and Friday. If you were not in front of the television at 5:05, you missed Blue Peter. There was no catch-up. There was no pause. The broadcast happened, and either you were there or you were not. The Radio Times, or the TV Times if you watched ITV, was a publication of genuine importance in that household. It sat on the arm of the settee. It was called the settee, not the sofa, and definitely not the couch. And it was consulted with the seriousness of a document. The evening meal was called tea in many households in the Midlands and the North, and supper in others, and the distinction was less about the food than about where you were from and who had raised you. But wherever you were from, the meal was cooked from scratch, more often than not, because convenience food in 1973 was not what it would become. There were tins, yes. There was the occasional bird's eye frozen meal. They had been making fish fingers since 1955, and their range was expanding. But the dominant mode of evening cooking in a British home was still a person at a stove, doing the work. The smell of the evening meal cooking was one of the great temporal markers of that life. It told you what time it was more reliably than any clock. The onions going in at around 5:30, that particular softening smell, sweet and slightly sharp. Then the mince browning in the pan, or the sausages beginning to colour in the grill pan, or the chicken roasting in the oven since 4 o'clock with a knob of lard rubbed across the skin and a quartered onion tucked inside, because that was how you roasted a chicken, and it was perfect, and it would always be perfect, and nothing that came after it was ever really as good. The table was laid. Not every family ate at a table. By the 1970s, the tray in front of the television was already a recognised phenomenon. But in many homes, the table was still a fixed ritual. Knives and forks placed correctly, a glass of water, perhaps a bottle of salad cream. Pudding was a matter of expectation, a tinned fruit cocktail in its pale syrup, eaten with evaporated milk from a tin that had been punctured with 2 holes using the pointed end of the opener, or a slice of Battenberg cake, each square of yellow and pink sponge distinct, wrapped in its layer of marzipan. The evening wound down in the same room where it had spent itself. The sitting room, with the television, with the fire, with the particular comfortable exhaustion of people who had done ordinary things and done them fully. The news was on at 9 o'clock. In 1976, it might have been Angela Rippon behind the desk, the first woman to present the main BBC News bulletin, a fact that felt genuinely significant at the time, because it was. Or it might have been the measured, unhurried tones of Alistair Burnett on ITV. The news told you about strikes, about the price of things, about a world that was not always easy and was not always kind, but was the world you lived in and were part of. The milk bottles were put out on the step, rinsed first, placed carefully, with a note tucked inside one of them if extra pints were needed for the weekend. The cat was let out, or refused to go out, and was negotiated with. The windows were checked. The back door was locked with the actual key, which hung on a hook in the kitchen and was never lost, because losing it would have been a serious inconvenience. The lights were turned off room by room, each click of the switch reducing the house a little further, returning it to the dark and the quiet. The bathroom was visited, the bathroom with its avocado green suite that had been fitted in 1972 and was, at the time of fitting, considered extremely modern. The bath was filled with water that was hot enough but not endlessly hot, because the hot water came from the immersion heater, and the immersion heater cost money to run, and you were mindful of that, always. You bathed or you washed at the sink, and the towel was warm from the towel rail and slightly scratchy in the way that cotton towels always were before fabric softener became a habit. You got into bed. The sheets were cool at the edges and warm at the centre. The hot water bottle was exactly where you'd hoped it would be. Outside, the street was quiet. One car passing at the far end, someone's gate closing, the distant murmur of a television through a neighbour's wall, and then silence. The silence of a British street in 1974 at 11 o'clock at night is something that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who wasn't there. It was not the absence of noise so much as the presence of stillness. The world was not on elsewhere without you. The world had, for the most part, also gone to bed. And that feeling of being contained, of the day being complete, of the night being genuinely and fully night, was one of the gifts of that era that we did not know we had until it was gone. The morning would come again tomorrow. The kettle would go on, The radio would find its voice. The milk would appear on the step. But before all of that, there is this, the last warmth of the hot water bottle, the weight of the blankets, the sound of a house settling into its foundations. A 1970s British home, breathing quietly at the end of a full and ordinary day. You were there. Some part of you still is. If this brought something back to you, please leave it in the comments below. Tell us about your home. Every detail matters. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. These stories only continue if there are people willing to listen. And we are just getting started.